Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where the air bites harder than your in-laws during Christmas dinner, and the warmest place in the house might be under a sleeping goat. Welcome to medieval Europe, circa 1300, where peasants lived through winters that could freeze your breath solid, and somehow, against all logic, they survived. No puffer jackets, no heated blankets, not even a sad little space heater humming away in the corner. Just grit, layers of wool, and an occasional fire that may or may not have choked everyone with smoke. So let's begin. First, take a breath. Now imagine it turning to mist instantly. You're not in a castle or a cozy cottage with a fire in every room. You're in a one-room hut, probably made from wattle and daub, basically sticks, mud, and hope. The roof thatched, the walls drafty, the insulation absolutely theoretical. There are cracks in the wood where the wind whispers in like a ghost with cold hands. Your door is a wooden plank, hung crooked, and doesn't quite shut. It creaks, it moans, it lets the entire winter in. But you're not alone. Oh no. In fact, you are very much not alone. Because it turns out, the best defense against freezing to death in the 14th century was to stack bodies like firewood. Peasants often slept several to a bed: mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, and possibly an assortment of animals. There's no concept of personal space here. You'd be lucky to claim a foot of straw mattress, if there was one at all. If not, you're lying on rushes spread over a hard floor, changed maybe once a season. Everyone shared heat, shared breath, shared lice. You haven't known true intimacy until you've woken up face to face with a snoring chicken. There is, surprisingly, some warmth in that closeness. A dozen bodies in one room can generate a lot of heat. It's like being a marshmallow in a human s'more, sweaty, slightly suffocating, but toasty in its own way. People didn't just sleep under wool or fur, they slept under each other. If one of your children wandered off to sleep in the corner, you pulled them back into the pile. This wasn't a drill, it was survival. And what about clothes? You know how you change into pajamas at night? Not in medieval Europe. You slept in what you wore, and you wore everything you owned. Linen underclothes, wool tunics, cloaks, sometimes layers that hadn't seen a wash since your last confession. The idea of changing clothes was reserved for saints and nobility. For a peasant, your outerwear was also your sleepwear, your workwear, and regrettably your formal wear. In terms of actual heating, the centerpiece was the hearth. And by hearth, I mean a fire pit in the middle of the room, often with no chimney. Smoke curled up and out through a hole in the roof, maybe. If the wind was wrong, it came right back down and into your lungs. If the fire went out overnight, you were in trouble. So families would bank the coals under ash, trying to preserve just enough warmth to reignite it at dawn. Think of it as medieval central heating, except it gave you black lung and third-degree burns. Still, people got creative. They warmed stones in the fire and tucked them under the straw mattress. Some even used iron pans filled with embers. What could possibly go wrong? And then there were foot-wrapping techniques: layers of rags, strips of wool, or in really desperate times, grease or lard smeared on the feet under wool socks. Because nothing says "I love staying warm" like pig fat between your toes. The floor was often just dirt, maybe covered in rushes, straw, or hay to absorb moisture. Sometimes herbs like lavender or mint were mixed in to mask the smell. Did it help? Not really, but it was better than raw mud. Moisture seeped up through the ground, and if you weren't careful, your toes could be gone by spring. Then there's the matter of animals. If you had livestock and you were lucky enough to own some, they didn't sleep in a barn. They slept with you. Chickens under the table, goats near the fire, sometimes even the family cow. This wasn't just for convenience. Animals radiated heat. Their breath and bodies added a few precious degrees to the air. Of course, they also added noise, smell, and the occasional surprise on the floor. But warmth was warmth. Daily life was wrapped around the rhythms of the cold. People went to bed early not for rest, but for warmth. Night was dangerous. Cold could kill. You didn't stay up chatting unless the fire was big and you had something hot to drink, like weak ale or pottage. Winter evenings were for prayers, mending clothes, whispering stories, and slowly retreating into layers of cloth and bodies. But perhaps the biggest reason they survived the cold was that they expected it. They didn't rage against the freeze. They didn't wait for spring like a reward. Winter wasn't a punishment, it was part of life. Something you endured, not something you solved. They didn't have thermal socks or electric blankets, but they had each other. They had systems, habits, fire, and a level of resilience that, frankly, would put most of us to shame. So tonight, as you lie in your heated room under your clean sheets, spare a thought for those who came before, who curled up in darkness, in scratchy wool, beside their children and their goats, who whispered stories while embers glowed low, who watched frost form on the inside of their walls and kept living anyway. You'd think they were just surviving, but they were also enduring, adapting, and yes, sleeping. Because that's what people do. Even in the cold, it's the middle of the night, you're shivering, awake, and convinced something just scurried across your feet. Congratulations, you've just spent your first evening in a medieval peasant home. And to be honest, you're lucky the roof hasn't collapsed yet. The word house might be a bit generous. These were more like semi-habitable rectangles, built from whatever materials were available: mud, straw, sticks, timber, and desperation. If you had stone walls, you were either rich, a monk, or living in the remains of a Roman ruin. Most peasants relied on wattle and daub, a woven lattice of sticks smeared with mud, manure, and straw. Think of it as very sad adobe, held together by hope and chicken droppings. And the roof thatch, a thick bundle of dried grasses or reeds layered to keep out the rain. Except it didn't. Not completely. Especially not after a few seasons of storms, birds nesting in the thatch, and rats setting up their own little rodent kingdom just above your bed. Every so often, something would fall from the rafters. Best case scenario, just some straw. Worst case, a spider or an entire ferret. Roofs had a lifespan of maybe 20 years if you were lucky and didn't live in a particularly damp area, which, in Europe, was rare. Most peasants had to patch holes with whatever they could find: bark, hide, fabric, pieces of another neighbor's roof if no one was looking. It was a group effort. Leaky thatch was as common as cold porridge. Windows, that's cute. There were openings, sure, but glass was far too expensive. If you were fancy, you might stretch a bit of oiled parchment or thin animal hide over the hole. More likely, you just had shutters, wooden ones that never quite closed, swelled in the rain, and squeaked with every gust. If you left them open for light, in came the wind and snow. If you shut them, your room became a smoky, dark box that smelled vaguely of feet, fire, and onions. The door was often a plank of wood hung on a loop of leather or rope, swung shut and secured with a beam. No locks. No hinges. It groaned when moved and warped when wet. In deep winter, it might even freeze shut, or worse, open, which meant cold air, stray animals, or that one weird neighbor who thought dropping by unannounced was totally acceptable. Inside, space was tight, usually, A single room did everything: sleep, cook, eat, live, survive. The central hearth smoldered, offering warmth and smoke in equal measure. The smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, or didn't. Some houses had smoke hoods or rudimentary chimneys made of mud and brick, but most peasants simply lived in a perpetual state of mild asphyxiation. The rafters were blackened. The walls absorbed decades of soot. Your lungs. Well, let's not talk about your lungs. Flooring dirt, plain and simple. In some wealthier homes, you might get wooden planks or stone in extreme luxury, but for most people, it was the ground. Over that, you'd scatter rushes or straw, sometimes herbs like lavender or mint to freshen the air. Did it help? Let's just say it was better than nothing. Rushes also absorbed spills, soot, animal droppings, and whatever else fell during daily life. They were changed maybe once a season, if that. During winter, every draft mattered. A breeze between roof and wall could suck out the precious heat in minutes. So peasants got creative. They stuffed gaps with moss, hay, old cloth, or fur. They hung old cloaks over windows. Some even piled dung or mud against the outside walls to act as crude insulation. Imagine living in a house where someone says, "It's going to snow, go pile more poop against the east wall." But these homes weren't just survival huts. They were ecosystems. In winter, the family didn't just include humans. Chickens, goats, pigs all lived inside, sharing heat, space, and unfortunate smells. Pens were built in corners, or animals were simply allowed to roam. The result was a floor that constantly needed cleaning, though cleaning is a very generous word. The pigs didn't ask politely before doing their business. And yes, this was normal. You didn't complain because there wasn't another option. You didn't live below the poverty line. There was no line. This was it. Life in a home that offered minimal shelter, questionable hygiene, and maximum shared suffering. But here's the twist: these homes worked. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but well enough. With the hearth burning, bodies huddled, and every crack stuffed. The inside of a peasant house was warmer than the outside. Temperatures might still dip below freezing, but they wouldn't be lethal. Most of the time, unless you were already sick, starving, or incredibly unlucky. Community played a part too. Families often visited each other during the darkest months, sharing stories, fire, and food. A neighbor might lend you straw or help repair your roof. Social ties weren't optional. They were lifelines. And in these fragile, flammable little houses, they glowed brighter than any hearth. Over time, peasants learned how to build better. In colder climates, houses were built lower, closer to the ground, to preserve heat. Roofs were steeper, to keep off snow. Walls were made thicker, with timber frames packed tight. Every generation adapted. And maybe that's the lesson. These homes weren't perfect. They were porous, crude, smoky. They failed often, but they were adapted, constantly adjusted, repaired, patched. People didn't expect the house to take care of them. They learned how to take care of the house. So tonight, as you snuggle under soft blankets in a room with double-paned windows and a thermostat that purrs with modern magic, think of those little huts, built by hand, lived in by everyone, and somehow, still standing, some of them, anyway. They weren't warm, but they were enough. So, you've made it inside. You've stepped over the pig. You've dodged the chicken. You've crouched by the hearth to warm your hands. And now you're looking for a place to sleep. There's only one bed. It's not particularly large. It's not particularly soft, but it is already full of people. Welcome to the medieval family bed, equal parts heat source, social institution, and exercising claustrophobia. Let's get one thing out of the way. There were no bedrooms, no sleeping quarters, no cozy little nooks with nightstands and candles and privacy. The medieval peasant home was a one-room situation. And if you were lucky enough to have a bed frame, congratulations, you were probably the wealthiest person on your street. Most people slept on mattresses filled with straw or rushes, thrown directly on the floor, or on wooden platforms raised just high enough to avoid the occasional rat. Now, imagine cramming your entire family, grandparents, parents, kids, possibly a neighbor's orphaned cousin into that single sleep space. Oh, and don't forget the baby. The baby always ends up in the middle, you know, for warmth, or to get kicked in the ribs by 7 different people. The truth is, peasants didn't sleep alone. They didn't even think to try. Warmth was survival, and the best insulation in a freezing house was the person next to you, and the person next to them, and the person clinging to your back like a freezing barnacle. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't spacious. It was effective. Human body heat, as it turns out, is the most ancient and reliable heating system known to man. And don't think you had the luxury of proper sleepwear. You slept in your clothes, whatever you'd worn all day. That meant layers of wool, linen, or whatever cloth hadn't been reduced to rags yet. Cloaks doubled as blankets. Shawls were turned into head wraps. If you had a hood, you wore it to bed. Feet were wrapped in cloth or tucked into someone's armpit. Modesty, not a concern. Warmth trumped everything. And now we must address the feet, because in every communal sleeping arrangement, there's always someone with feet that smell like week-old cabbage. Multiply that by 6, in a space with no ventilation, with animals nearby, and perhaps a fire smoldering, its smoke settling just above your head, and no one had bathed in, well, let's say recently, and be kind. Comfort was never the goal. Sleep was more of a strategy than a luxury. You might doze for a few hours, wake when someone rolled over or sneezed, then fall asleep again. Snoring everywhere, coughing constant. And let's not even start on the lice or the fleas. If you were particularly blessed, the house cat might sleep near your feet and eat the bugs. A small mercy, with claws. There were no pillows, at least, not the plush, fluffy kind. You might have a cloth sack stuffed with straw or feathers, or more likely, you used your own arm, or someone else's arm, or a folded-up cloak. Neck support was a fantasy, and spinal alignment was a concept that hadn't been invented yet. And if you needed to get up in the middle of the night to relieve yourself, oh no. You were climbing over at least 3 people, stepping over the dog, dodging the fire, and locating the chamber pot in the dark. Miss, and someone's getting a surprise puddle in the morning. But believe it or not, this closeness had its perks. In the dark, before the world turned electric, sleep was often segmented. People fell asleep shortly after sunset, slept for a few hours, woke up around midnight, talked, prayed, gossiped, maybe even worked a little by firelight, then went back to bed for a second sleep. These waking periods were intimate, a shared quiet, time for reflection, hushed conversation, and warmth without the chaos of the daytime. You learned things while lying in that tangle of limbs. You heard your grandmother's stories. You listened to your father's snores and knew he was still alive. You felt your baby brother's feet twitch as he dreamed of probably turnips, or falling into a stream, or stealing a goose. Even dreams were communal. People shared them in the morning, wondering aloud what they meant. Was it a message from a saint, a vision from God, or just too much garlic in the evening pottage? The line between the spiritual and the physical was thin. Sleep was full of mystery. Of course, not everyone in the bed was family. In very poor households, beds were shared with unrelated people, two farmhands, visitors, even strangers. It was just what you did. There was no such thing as personal space. There was survival space, and it was doled out according to age, size, and the urgency of your shivering. Children often slept at the foot of the bed, curled up like cats. Elders got the sides, less crawling required. Middle-aged adults were in the center, forming the warmth core. If there was an infant, everyone arranged themselves around it like bricks in a bread oven, not because they were sentimental, but because babies die quickly in the cold. Did people complain? Probably, but not in any recorded way. This wasn't unusual. This was normal. What we would consider deeply uncomfortable was, for them, simply how the night went. You ate together. You worked together. You slept together. The family was the heating system. The home was a body. And in that strange, uncomfortable intimacy, there was security. You might not know what tomorrow held. You might be one bad harvest away from hunger. But for now, tonight, your people were near. The fire was low. The wind howled outside but inside. The quiet rhythm of breathing, snoring, muttering, and the occasional fart meant life continued. That's how peasants survived the cold. Not because their houses were warm or their beds were soft, but because they had each other. And you'd be surprised how much heat a dozen freezing humans can generate. You might think the worst part of medieval winter was the wind, or maybe the lack of hot showers, or the existential dread of living during a time when sneezing too hard might kill you. But no, when it came to bedtime, the real trial was this: there were no real blankets. At least, not the kind you're picturing. No fluffy duvets. No quilts lovingly stitched with floral patterns. Just whatever you had, however filthy it was, and whoever was willing to share it. So let's talk about layers, because layers were everything. A medieval peasant's bedding wasn't a set. It was a collection. A random heap of anything that might trap heat for just a little longer than nothing at all. If you were lucky, and I mean truly blessed by the saints, you might have a thick wool blanket or fur cover. These were precious, often handed down for generations, and smelling like all of them. They were heavy, scratchy, and possibly alive with bugs. But they were warm, or at least not cold, which, in context, was close enough to joy. Most people didn't own enough wool to make full blankets, so they layered scraps of cloth, cloaks, or worn-out clothing. Old tunics became top covers. Shawls were draped across chests. If you had a hooded cloak, you slept in it. If your neighbor had a hide coat and wasn't using it, you asked nicely, or bribed them with onions. The point is, blankets were improvised. Then there was straw, lots of it. Straw filled the mattress, if you were rich enough to have one. If not, you slept directly on it, or under it, or beside it, or inside a pile of it like a human hamster. It crackled, it itched, it harbored bugs, it shifted all night. But it insulated. Not well, but better than air. And by January, you didn't care how it felt. You just wanted to feel something. Some households had fur pelts, usually from goats, sheep, or rabbits. These weren't fancy capes, they were literally just skins with the hair still on them. The hair might fall out in clumps. They might smell like the animal they came from. But oh, did they trap heat? Curl up beneath one of those and you'd briefly forget you could see your breath. For those without wool or fur, you had to get creative. People used sacking cloth, rough, heavy material originally meant for hauling grain. Some even used canvas, linen sheets layered tenfold, or planted moss pressed between fabric to act as stuffing. When desperate, you wrapped yourself in the rush mat you'd spent the day walking on. Yes, the same one covered in dirt, crumbs, chicken droppings, and whatever your uncle coughed up. Not ideal, but again, warmish. And it wasn't just what you put over your body, it was what you wrapped around it. Medieval folks swaddled themselves like burritos. Long strips of cloth were wound around the torso, arms, and legs before bed. Not for modesty, for insulation. Your outermost layer might be a sheepskin cloak, crusted with age. Your underlayer shirts that hadn't been removed since autumn. Feet were bandaged with rags, sometimes soaked in grease to seal in body heat. It sounds gross, and it was. But in winter, the rule was simple: layer it, or lose it. This system wasn't just physical, it was strategic. The first to bed got the warm spot. The last one in made sure the fire was covered with ash to preserve embers. You didn't waste heat. You built it person by person, blanket by blanket, dog by dog, dog by. Speaking of dogs, they were the MVPs of the medieval bed. Not every household had one, but those that did knew their worth. A dog at your feet was better than a pair of socks. A cat on your chest, that was luxury. They were warm, soft, and didn't complain when you wrapped your frozen hands around them like little fuzzy heaters. There's also a good chance you shared your bed with mice, or fleas, or lice. These weren't invited guests, but they came anyway. Blankets were rarely washed. Most textiles were scrubbed with lye soap, which was harsh, time-consuming, and risked destroying the fabric. So people avoided it. And what happens when you sleep under the same layers, night after night? Month after month, let's just say itchy was a permanent state of being. Still, those itchy, ragged layers kept people alive. The average peasant might not have had proper medical care or reliable food, but they had systems. Systems for layering. Systems for sleep rotation. Systems for stuffing straw between their knees to keep joints from aching. It was DIY thermal engineering with a side of hay fever. What's remarkable is how ingrained this was. Children grew up learning the blanket hierarchy. Who got the wool? Who got the sheepskin? Who got the drafty corner of the room with the questionable mat made from cabbage sacks? It was all passed down like folklore. Generational knowledge wrapped in textile fragments. And here's the part no one talks about: they adjusted. Not just seasonally, but nightly. If it snowed, you added more. If someone had a fever, they got the best layer. If the fire died, everyone rolled closer. If it rained and part of the roof leaked onto the bedding, well, congratulations. That's your damp corner now. They didn't wait for comfort to arrive. They invented it, night after freezing night. So as you wrap yourself in clean cotton sheets, maybe fluff your duvet, or curse mildly because your heated blanket isn't heating fast enough, think about those peasants curled under straw, wrapped in worn-out clothes, holding on to scraps of warmth and stories. They may not have had much, but what they had, they shared. And sometimes, that was enough. Let's say it's 2 a.m. You're lying in a straw bed under a scratchy cloak that smells like your cousin and wet goats, and your toes are starting to go numb. Not figuratively, literally. The fire's nothing but a ghost. Someone just coughed on your neck. And frost is creeping down the inside of the wall like a slow-moving curse. What do? You improvise. Because medieval peasants didn't have thermal underwear or heated slippers. They had dirt floors, poor insulation, and the relentless certainty of January. But what they lacked in resources, they made up for in wildly creative and sometimes questionable homegrown warmth hacks. Let's start with heated objects. If you had access to fire, you had access to heat transfer, even if no one called it that yet. Before bed, you'd bury a stone or brick in the hearth ashes. Let it soak up the warmth all evening. Then, when you were ready to sleep, you'd carefully wrap it in cloth and slide it under your blanket or tuck it by your feet if you were brave. It was the medieval equivalent of a hot water bottle, but with blisters if you misjudged. Some peasants used metal pans, called bed warmers, filled with hot embers from the fire. These were fancy, risky. One careless move, and congratulations, you've set the bedding ablaze. Again. But they worked, as long as you didn't fall asleep with it pressed against your thigh. Then there was the body heat strategy, which we've touched on before, but let's go deeper. The logic was simple: if the air is cold, don't fight it alone. Everyone's internal furnace is burning at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and together, you're a walking sauna. You didn't just share a bed, you curled, tucked, spooned, and layered on top of each other like a group of burrito fillings. It wasn't romantic, it was survival. If you had no one to share heat with, you might get cozy with an animal. Dogs, cats, sheep, whatever you had. A sheep's belly makes a surprisingly effective foot warmer, and it doesn't ask questions. Cows were kept in stables or attached lean-tos. But sometimes, when the cold was bad enough, they were brought inside. And not just for the heat. Their breath, the actual steam from their nostrils, warmed the air slightly. Slightly, enough to matter. Now, about feet. Feet were always a problem. Poor circulation, thin shoes, no socks. If you had socks, they were wool. And if you lost one, it could take months to replace. So people got creative. Enter grease. Yes, you read that right. Peasants would rub animal fat, usually pig lard or tallow, on their feet before bed. Why? Because it created a protective, oily barrier that helped trap heat. Think of it as medieval Vaseline, with the added bonus of smelling like dinner. After greasing up, feet were wrapped in rags, or stuffed into old pieces of cloth, or layered inside worn leather. Not glamorous, not dry, but cozy, surprisingly. Yes. You could also heat your feet by doing pre-sleep calisthenics. No, not yoga. Just good old-fashioned moving around like a maniac before collapsing. Jumping, stomping, hauling water, swinging an axe. Anything to get the blood flowing before you dove under the covers and tried to trap the warmth you just built. It wasn't a routine. It was a reflex. And sometimes, the solution wasn't warmth, it was numbness. If your fingers or toes went icy, you didn't panic. You flexed. You rubbed. You stuck them in your armpits, or someone else's armpits. If they were generous and/or asleep, hands were rarely left exposed. If you had gloves, they stayed on all day and night. If not, you tucked your hands into your belt, your sleeves, your shirt, your hood, whatever crevice could hold them. Clothing was your insulation system. There wasn't one outfit for the day and one for bed. There was one outfit, period. You wore layers upon layers, often greasy, stiff, patched, and full of mystery odors, and those layers stayed on until they literally fell apart. Underlayers were rarely changed. Overlayers were never washed. But altogether, they trapped heat. Bare skin was a luxury you couldn't afford. It was a liability. Some folks even built windbreaks inside the house, hanging old cloaks or cloth sheets from ceiling beams to block drafts. These makeshift curtains sectioned off the warmest part of the room usually around the hearth. In essence, they created a medieval heated zone where people and animals huddled like exiled royalty. The other half of the room, well, that was just storage for potatoes or ghosts. Now, let's talk headwear. You always wore something on your head, even indoors. A wool cap, a hood, a scarf wrapped tightly under the chin. Heat escapes through the scalp, and every bit counted. Children sometimes wore nightcaps, and adults tied their hair under cloth strips. A bare head was as foolish as a bare foot. But maybe the most important trick wasn't physical, it was mental. You didn't waste time longing for spring. You didn't dwell on how cold it was. You just adapted. You worked. You layered. You rubbed your feet with lard and tucked yourself between two relatives and accepted the smell of sheep as part of the ambiance. Complaining didn't make you warmer. You focused on getting through the night. And in the morning, if you woke up with all 10 fingers, all 10 toes, and minimal frostbite, that was a win. You might even treat yourself to a hot bowl of porridge, or a splash of weak ale, lukewarm from sitting near the fire. Maybe you'd stand in the doorway, teeth chattering, and say something truly inspiring like, "Well, that wasn't so bad." Because the truth is, it was bad. But they survived anyway. With grease, grit, and a goat at their feet. You've made it through another night barely. Your breath still clouds the air. Your toes are somewhat attached. And the rooster is screaming as if it's won a battle. But before you even think about breakfast, there's one sacred duty above all: check the fire. Because in a medieval peasant home, the fire wasn't just heat, it was everything. Your stove, your light, your protection, your central family member. If it went out in the night, there wasn't a cheerful little click to restart it. No matches, no lighters, just a pit of cold ash, a shivering family, and the realization that someone was walking to the neighbor's house with a clay pot and a very apologetic expression. The fire, usually located in a central hearth, was a peasant's best defense against death by exposure. And keeping it alive overnight was both art and obsession. You didn't let it burn bright and fast. That was wasteful. You banked it, raked the embers together, covered them with ash or damp turf, and hoped they'd smolder until morning. A small, glowing heart beneath a mound of gray. It was delicate. It was crucial. It was one ember between survival and frostbite. Some households developed elaborate rituals around fire preservation. Before bed, you'd stir the coals, whisper a prayer, maybe spit on a log for luck, not scientifically proven. But medieval logic wasn't picky. You placed slow-burning fuel, thicker logs, damp turf, dried peat, anything that would smolder instead of blaze. A blazing fire was for feasts. A smoke coughing, long-burning lump of misery was for real winter nights. And if you were lucky, it would still glow when the rooster crowed. Then you gently prod it back to life, add kindling, and coax a flame like a parent waking a grumpy toddler. If it caught quickly, you felt like a magician. If it didn't, you cursed the saints and tried again, possibly while stepping on a chicken or two. Now, not all hearths were created equal. Wealthier peasants might have stone hearths with built-in vents or chimneys. Most, though, had open fire pits, literally a hole in the ground or a raised section of flat stones. Smoke had to go somewhere. So roofs often had a smoke hole, a small, unglazed opening that vented fumes directly into your eyeballs if the wind was unkind, which it often was. The walls, rafters, and ceiling beams above the hearth were permanently stained with soot. You could look up and guess the age of the house by how black the ceiling was. In some homes, hams, herbs, or fish were strung from the beams, partially to cure, partially to keep them away from animals, and partially to absorb enough smoke to be declared fireproof. That smoke did more than just make your eyes sting. It was functional. It kept insects at bay, preserved wood, dried out damp corners, and added a sort of warm, acrid ambiance to the home. You smelled like smoke. Your bread tasted like smoke. Your child, born during winter, probably smelled like smoke. And no one noticed, because smoke was survival. And then there was the firewood, or more often, the lack of it. Trees were valuable. Most peasants couldn't just wander into a forest and start chopping. Much of the land was owned by the lord or the church, and gathering wood without permission could lead to fines, punishment, or in extreme cases, getting your hands chopped off, which is bad for gathering more wood. So peasants burned what they could: fallen branches, peat, dried dung, chopped brush, even dried bundles of straw twisted into fuel torches. In some areas, they used heather, furze, or bracken, whatever was nearby and flammable. Charcoal was expensive and rarely used by common folk. You didn't waste fuel. You cherished every crackle. This meant the fire wasn't always warm. It smoked. It hissed. It smoldered. It coughed like a 70-year-old man in the rain. It filled the house with haze. But it was there. It boiled your broth. It dried your socks. It warmed your hands just enough to keep working. It was never hot enough to make the whole room comfortable, but it changed the air, took the bite out of the frost, reminded you that life, somewhere, was still burning. And the fire was more than just practical, it was symbolic. A good fire meant a good home. It was where you gathered, where stories were told, where prayers were whispered. The glow of a hearth could mean safety, family, routine. Children were raised around it. Bread was baked beside it. And when someone died, the fire was kept going as a gesture of memory, something warm in the face of something cold. In a way, the fire was the heart of the home. Not because it was large or bright, but because it was constant. Even when everything else, weather, crops, health, politics, was beyond your control, the fire was yours. You could tend it. You could protect it. And in return, it protected you. So if, one morning, you found it had gone cold, that wasn't just an inconvenience. That was panic. That meant trudging across frozen fields, clay pot in hand, to beg for fire from a neighbor. It meant swallowing your pride, or freezing. Your neighbors, of course, understood. They'd been there. No one judged you for failing the fire. They just helped relight it. Because fires went out, but people didn't let each other. So tonight, as your thermostat hums softly and your blanket warms your feet without risk of setting the house ablaze, imagine the flicker of an ancient fire, just enough to push back the dark. Picture a mother adding straw, a child blowing gently on the ember, a father shielding it with his hands. They didn't need light. They needed life. And they found it in the fire. Let's say you finally get warm. You're tucked under a sheepskin. A dog is snoring softly against your hip. Your cousin is using your shoulder as a pillow. And the fire has been successfully bullied back to life. All is calm. All is well. Still kind of cold, but better. And just when you think you might get a full night of sleep, someone sits up, yawns, and starts spinning wool by the fire. What? Welcome to the ancient world of segmented sleep, where nobody really slept all the way through the night, and that was entirely normal. You see, in medieval Europe, the idea of 8 solid hours of uninterrupted sleep didn't exist. It wasn't even considered healthy. Instead, people had 2 sleeps. The first began not long after sundown, maybe 7 or 8 p.m., in winter. Everyone would bundle up and fall into that wonderful exhausted heap we've already described. They'd sleep for 3 to 4 hours. Then somewhere around midnight, people would naturally wake up. Not because they had insomnia, because their bodies told them to. This in-between period had a name: the watch. It was a strange and quiet time. Too dark to work in the fields, too cold to wander far, but perfect for everything else. Some used it for prayer, a time to talk to God without interruption. Others took advantage of the moment to tend the fire, check on animals, or empty the chamber pot, though, let's be honest. No one wanted that job. Some would talk quietly, gossip, tell stories, even have sex. Medieval medical texts recommended the second sleep as the ideal time for conceiving children. Why? Because everyone was relaxed, warm, slightly less grumpy, possibly too tired to argue. Others used the time for chores, quiet ones: spinning wool, sewing, mending clothes, tasks you could do by the low light of the hearth. It wasn't industrious in a frantic way. It was peaceful. The world had narrowed down to a few glowing feet around the fire. Time slowed. And then, eventually, maybe 2 hours later, people would go back to bed, fall into their second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This rhythm, first sleep, waking watch, second sleep, was as natural to medieval peasants as breathing. It shows up in diaries, in literature, even in legal records. If someone committed a crime between sleeps, everyone knew what time that meant. Roughly midnight to 3 a.m. That twilight zone where bodies were awake, but minds still dreamy. So what happened if you couldn't fall back asleep? Nothing. No one panicked. No one reached for herbal tea or muttered about melatonin. You just sat by the fire, listened to the wind, stroked the dog, maybe told your niece a story. You waited. Eventually, sleep would come again. And if it didn't, you'd nap later. During lunch, in church, anywhere. Really. This segmented sleep was practical, especially in winter. It allowed for monitoring the fire, checking livestock, and keeping the house safe. Not everyone was awake at once, but someone usually was. It created a natural, gentle rotation, a kind of community night shift, without clocks or alarms. And it changed how people thought about dreams. Because if you slept in 2 parts, you had 2 sets of dreams. The first sleep was often deeper, filled with symbolic, intense dreams. The second sleep brought lighter, more fleeting images. People compared the two, analyzed them, believed the space between sleeps was a liminal time when your soul wandered, when God whispered, when fate might nudge your thoughts just enough to change your day. Now, let's talk logistics. In a home filled with people and animals, how did anyone wake naturally at midnight without an alarm clock? Simple bladders. Someone always had to pee. Or a baby cried. Or the fire hissed out. Or a goat kicked the wall. There was no such thing as absolute silence. Medieval nights were alive, with creaks, coughs, sniffles, whispers, and shifting feet. When someone woke, others often stirred too. Not fully, but enough. You might mutter, grunt, roll over, toss another log on the fire, maybe say, cold. Isn't it in here? Colder than last week. And then fall silent again. There's something oddly beautiful about this. Imagine that hour between sleeps, your cheeks warm from the fire, the rest of the house shadowed in sleep. You can hear your father softly snoring, The wind in the thatch. The quiet cluck of a hen. It's peaceful, connected. A different kind of night, where time feels thicker, less rushed, less lonely. Modern people might call it interrupted sleep. Medieval peasants called it normal. And here's the kicker: some researchers believe we're wired for this. That artificial light, rigid work schedules, and sleep hygiene rules have actually broken our natural rhythms. That our ancestors had it more right than we thought. So next time you wake up at 2 a.m., don't reach for your phone. Just imagine a dark cottage, a banked fire, and someone, long ago, spinning wool by the hearth, waiting for second sleep. You've survived the first sleep, stirred during the watch, and now you're settling back down for your second round of slumber. But let's pause for a moment and address something we've tiptoed around so far. Nobody took their clothes off. Not for bed, not for comfort, not even, really, for decency. Why? Because in a medieval winter, clothing wasn't fashion, it was armor. Against cold, against damp, against lice, against death. And once it went on in October, it didn't come off until, well, spring. Maybe. Let's start with the basics. A typical medieval peasant wore multiple layers: a linen shirt or shift, a wool tunic, wool leggings or hose, and some form of cloak, shawl, or outer wrap, and socks, if they were lucky, plus a hat or hood that may or may not have doubled as a pillow. All of this stayed on, at all times, day and night. Removing clothing for sleep was seen as unnecessary, if not downright dangerous. You could catch a chill. You could weaken your body. You could invite spirits, yes. Some believed sleeping nude or even lightly dressed made you more vulnerable to evil. And besides, changing in a room filled with your parents, grandparents, siblings, livestock, and possibly a visiting cooper wasn't exactly relaxing. So how did this work in practice? Let's walk through a typical bedtime routine. You'd sleep in the same tunic you wore to plow fields, the same hose you wore to visit the market, the same shift you mended in by candlelight. These clothes were stiff, oily, heavy with use. The linen closest to your skin might get rinsed occasionally, but wool was eternal. You might brush it, air it out, maybe beat it with a stick if you were feeling fancy. But washing it, that was risky. Wool shrank. Wool warped. Wool was expensive. Better to just keep wearing it and let your natural smell eventually defeat any bugs living in the seams. And yes, bugs were a constant companion. Fleas, lice, bed bugs, they thrived in unwashed textiles. People scratched, picked, and muttered in the dark. Some tried to prevent infestation by rubbing herbs, lavender, rosemary, wormwood into their clothes. Others just hoped the cold would kill them. Spoiler, it didn't. Still, for all the discomfort, these clothes were lifelines. Peasants didn't undress. They repositioned their clothes for maximum warmth. Tunics were tucked under arms or pulled over knees. Cloaks doubled as blankets. Scarves became face masks. People tied cloth around their calves, their wrists, even across their mouths to keep the cold out of their lungs while they slept. One particularly committed strategy involved stuffing straw into your clothes literally between layers to create padding and insulation. You rustled when you moved, but you stayed alive. Let's talk about underwear. Did they have it? Kind of. Some men wore braids, loose linen shorts that doubled as sleepwear. Women had long shifts, which served as both nightgown and underlayer. These weren't changed daily, not even weekly. If you had 2 shifts, you were rich. If you had three, you were royalty or a laundress who needed extras. Most people wore one shift until it disintegrated. It soaked up sweat, grease, smoke, soot, and then kept doing it. Shoes, at least, were removed before bed usually. Peasant shoes were made from leather, often stuffed with moss or straw for warmth. You might take them off and leave them by the hearth, hoping they'd dry out. Or you might keep them on if the floor was too wet, or if you didn't trust your brother not to borrow them just for a minute and forget to return them. Again, priorities. Clothes were more than warmth, they were status. Even among peasants, your clothing said something. A wool tunic that reached your knees, you were doing well. A cloak that wrapped around twice, you were a legend. Children often wore hand-me-downs from 5 different cousins. Clothes were patched, stitched, dyed with onion skins or mud, and passed down like sacred relics. They were visible wealth, worn constantly, slept in, lived in, and eventually buried in. And here's the odd thing despite all this. Medieval people were deeply concerned with modesty. They didn't undress, but they cared about how much skin showed. Even sleeping fully clothed, some would adjust their layers to make sure their chest or legs were covered appropriately, especially if there were guests, or someone of the opposite sex, or literally anyone else in the room, which was always. Privacy was rare. So was cleanliness. But warmth came from the accumulated insulation of fabric, body odor, and a total refusal to ever be nude. And when clothes finally came off, it was a major event. Bath days, few and far between, were planned with military precision. You'd heat water, pour it into a wooden tub, undress layer by layer like an archaeological dig, and wash quickly before your modesty or the water's warmth evaporated. Then, back into the same old clothes, only slightly damp, and now smelling like smoke and soap. So tonight, when you change into soft pajamas, toss your clothes in a washing machine and climb under a clean sheet. Remember this: your medieval ancestors are judging you. And they're cold, and they are still wearing their tunics. So, you're wrapped in 3 layers of wool, you've banked the fire, and your feet are covered in lard and rags. Perfect. You're ready for a peaceful night's sleep. Except now there's a foot in your face, and it's not even your foot. Because in a medieval peasant household, you never slept alone. Privacy. That's a luxury for kings and ghosts. For everyone else, sleep was a group activity, whether you liked it or not. Let's start with the basics. Peasant homes were small, sometimes one room, often with a dirt floor and a thatched roof so low you could accidentally headbutt it in your sleep. These homes served as kitchen, living room, bedroom, nursery, hospital, an occasional barn all in one. So at night, everyone packed in like spoons in a drawer. Parents, children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, dogs, cats, chickens, maybe even a goat or two, all sharing the same space, and often the same bed. Or more likely, the same pile of vaguely warm materials that counted as a bed. This wasn't considered strange. In fact, it was comforting. A warm body next to you meant less heat lost, less risk of freezing, and someone to steal straw from if you woke up cold. Babies were usually kept tucked under their mother's arms. Toddlers flailed like tiny windmills, and grandpa snored like a moose with bronchitis. If you were a child, you probably didn't have a bed. You had a corner, or a spot next to the fire, or a bundle of rags and straw stuffed behind a barrel. If you were lucky, you slept near your siblings, though that also meant sharing their fleas. If you were unlucky, you slept by the door, the drafty door, the door that never quite closed. Now, you might wonder, what if you needed space? Tough. Sleeping arrangements were strategic. You slept with the people who needed warmth the most in the middle infants, the elderly, the sick. The warmer folks, red adults and teens with decent circulation, slept along the edges, often pressed against the wall to block drafts. Dogs were often at the feet. Cats wandered freely, occasionally biting your nose or sitting directly on your bladder because why not? The idea of separate bedrooms or even beds was laughable, even in slightly larger homes. With more than one room, the best someone could hope for was a raised platform of straw or a curtained-off area, which provided about as much privacy as whispering in a wind tunnel. But it felt separate, and that was enough. Couples didn't sleep apart unless they were fighting or someone had the plague. Even then, there wasn't much distance to be had. And if your cousin or neighbor was visiting, yep, they climbed in too. Space was limited. Warmth was finite. Etiquette was overridden by survival. This proximity came with its own set of rules. You didn't talk loudly at night. You didn't toss and turn too much. You definitely didn't fart with enthusiasm. People had a basic agreement: we're all stuck here, so let's keep it peaceful. And if someone broke that code, there were consequences, like being assigned to the dreaded cold spot near the outer edge, or even banished to sleep beside the fire with the wood lice. Yet for all its chaos, there was something strangely intimate about this arrangement. Families grew close. Children felt safe. You could hear your mother's breathing, your father's cough, your sister's muttered dream talk. There was no such thing as loneliness. In winter, you fell asleep listening to soft snores, the pop of the fire, the occasional scratch of a chicken adjusting itself on the beam overhead. And communal sleeping wasn't limited to peasants. Even in monasteries, inns, or military barracks, group sleep was the norm. Monks often slept in long dormitory halls, fully clothed, under thin blankets, in synchronized silence. Travelers shared beds at inns with total strangers. There was no option to book your own room. You paid for a place on the bed, and that bed might already have 3 other people in it, none of whom had bathed in recent memory. If you were on the road, sleeping in a barn was often better than a roadside tavern. At least the hay was clean, the cows were quiet, and nobody tried to steal your shoes while you snored. Of course, all this proximity had downsides. Lice spread like wildfire. Illnesses bounced from person to person, and good luck getting any sleep if someone was a chronic sleep talker with opinions. But medieval people adapted. They built habits, routines, tolerances. They used herbs under pillows to fight odor. They developed the remarkable skill of sleeping through anything: snoring, creaking beams, coughing fits, surprise chicken attacks. In short, sleep wasn't personal. It was communal survival. So tonight, when you stretch out in your private bed, maybe even complain about your pillow being slightly too warm, think of your medieval counterpart wedged between siblings, wrapped in a sheep-smelling cloak, listening to Grandpa wheeze in the dark. Alone. Never. Uncomfortable. Absolutely. And warm. Just enough to live. Picture this: you're lying in a peasant bed, that is, a creaky wooden frame or a pile of straw stuffed in a sack. Your feet are slowly thawing, and your cousin is still elbowing you in the ribs. You've made peace with the fact that your blanket smells like cabbage and wet wool, and just as you're drifting off for your second sleep, your stomach growls loudly, because guess what? You didn't exactly go to bed full. Medieval peasants ate early, usually 1 or 2 meals a day, and by sundown, the food was long gone. Dinner, such as it was, happened around 4 or 5 p.m. Once the sun dipped, Firewood was too precious to waste on cooking and light. That meant you went to bed on a mostly empty stomach, a condition we now call intermittent fasting, but which they called life. But what if the hunger pangs were too much? Enter the medieval midnight snack. Now, to be clear, this wasn't the glamorous kind of snacking. There was no fridge to open, no leftovers to microwave, no secret stash of chocolate hidden behind the barley sack. This was purely functional eating. And it happened quietly, in the shadows, between the first and second sleep. So what was on the menu? Usually bread, and not the fluffy, bakery fresh kind either. We're talking hard, dense, dry as sawdust peasant bread. It had the texture of a roof tile and the flavor of regret. But it was filling, and it didn't spoil quickly. Many families kept a hunk of it near the hearth, either on a hook, in a wooden bowl, or wrapped in a cloth. If you woke up hungry, you'd break off a chunk, chew slowly, and thank the heavens you didn't have to kill a squirrel for protein that night. If you were very lucky, your bread came with drippings, the leftover fat from cooking meat, saved in a pot and spread thinly like butter. It added calories, flavor, and enough grease to make your fingers shiny. It was the medieval version of nacho cheese, glorious, mysterious, and a little sad. Another option, Ale. Yes, warm ale, not chilled, not carbonated, just mildly alcoholic. Vaguely sour liquid brewed from barley, water, and hope. It was safer than water and often kept in a jug by the fire. A few sips could take the edge off your hunger, warm your chest, and make it easier to ignore the fact that your brother just muttered in his sleep about rats again. If the weather was harsh, and someone had foresight, there might be a pot of pottage simmering low in the hearth. This was the peasant staple, a stew of grains, legumes, herbs, and whatever scraps you could spare. It could sit for days, getting thicker and more mysterious each hour. You didn't necessarily eat it fresh, you ate it ongoing. But more often than not, there wasn't food available at midnight. So people got creative. Some chewed herbs or roots to calm the stomach. Horseradish, fennel, and wild garlic were common. Not tasty, but distracting. Others simply drank hot water if they could coax the fire into heating it. Or they chewed old cheese rinds, or gnawed on apple cores that had survived the week. In especially hard times, peasants chewed twigs, or cloth, or nothing at all. They just pulled the blanket tighter and told themselves stories to forget the gnawing in their belly. Because hunger was normal, and managing it was part of sleep. Interestingly, there were cultural rules about eating at night. Some considered it unholy to eat between sleeps. Monks, for instance, had strict fasting hours, though exceptions were made for illness, old age, or freezing to death. Other communities saw the watch, that midnight interval, as a time for quiet reflection, not chewing. But peasants broke those rules when their ribs started poking through their tunics. And food wasn't just for the stomach. It was comfort. A scrap of bread shared between siblings in the dark could be a moment of peace. A cup of ale passed from one hand to another was more than calories, it was connection. In a cold, uncertain world, sharing food, however small, was a rebellion against the misery of winter. Let's not forget the animals. Dogs got bones, sometimes. Cats caught their own snacks. Chickens, if they weren't asleep on the beam above your head, were left to peck whatever was frozen to the floor. The pig, well, it was probably already eaten. Pigs didn't survive long enough to see spring unless they were enormous and terrifying. Most were turned into sausage before the frost hit hard. And yes, food theft was a thing. If your cousin left his hunk of bread too close to your sleeping spot, you might accidentally roll over and discover it had vanished into your blanket. Accidents happen. So did bite marks. And the occasional family fight over who drank the last of the ale. Midnight hunger makes monsters of us all. So tonight, when you pad to your kitchen and raid the fridge for a snack, think about the peasant version of this moment. A sliver of dry bread, a sip of warm ale, the fire hissing quietly, and someone whispering, "Don't wake the baby," or the goat. It wasn't a feast, but it got them through the night. You finally managed it. Stomach pacified by a brick of bread and a sip of warm ale. Your limbs tucked around the fire like a makeshift human puzzle. And your cousin's foot blessedly no longer on your spine. You drift into sleep and enter the other world. Because in medieval Europe, dreams weren't just dreams. They were messages, warnings, omens, possibly divine, possibly demonic, but never meaningless. To the medieval mind, sleep was a time when the soul wandered, literally drifted out of the body and explored unseen realms. Dreams could reveal hidden truths, glimpse the future, or expose secret sins. They weren't just something that happened. They were something to interpret, to fear, to respect. You might dream of following a common theme, then and now, but instead of blaming it on stress, your medieval self would worry they were descending into hell. You might dream of water and panic that a flood or illness was coming. Dream of a dog that could mean loyalty or betrayal or rabies. Interpretations were slippery things, best left to wise women, priests, or that one uncle who always smelled like onions and gave cryptic advice. Books were written about this stuff. One of the most famous was the Dream Book of Daniel, a collection of common dream symbols and their meanings, copied and recopied across Europe. According to it, dreaming of bread meant peace, dreaming of death, rebirth, dreaming of your teeth falling out. Okay, that one still means doom. For peasants, dreams were also a form of storytelling. After the second sleep, when everyone stirred and the rooster was still on snooze mode, people would share their dreams. Over the fire, in the fields, at the bakehouse. Dreams were entertainment, gossip, and sometimes evidence. Because here's the twist: if your dream involved a dead relative warning you of bad grain, or a saint telling you not to trust the miller, people took that seriously. Entire communities could change behavior based on a single vivid dream. Fields might be avoided, marriages postponed, feasts canceled. Because God, it was believed, spoke through dreams, especially to the humble and poor. But not all dreams were holy. Some were sent by the devil. That's why people feared nightmares, especially those involving dark figures, weight on the chest, or waking up unable to move. Today, we'd call this sleep paralysis. Back then, they called it the mare, a malevolent spirit or demon that sat on your chest and sucked your breath away. It's where we get the word nightmare. To fight the mare, people would sleep with iron under the bed, wear protective charms, or recite specific prayers before sleeping. In some regions, they'd place a knife under the pillow or tuck rosemary into their shirts. Superstition wasn't optional, it was strategy. And if someone had a truly terrible dream, they went straight to the priest. Confession, prayer, and sometimes even fasting might be prescribed, because a dream could be a symptom of guilt, of sin, of divine displeasure. And ignoring it was risky. Now, this might sound like a lot of pressure for something you don't control, but dreams were one of the few personal experiences peasants had that couldn't be taxed, taken, or publicly measured. They were private, mysterious, and in a world where peasants had little agency, dreams gave them meaning. There were even communal interpretations. If multiple people in a village dreamed of fire, or wolves, or floods, it might spark a local panic. Dream gossip traveled fast. Did you hear Marjorie dreamed of her teeth falling out and her cow died the next day? Coincidence. Not if you lived in 1302. Dreams also became stories. A dream about flying could evolve into a tale about witches. A dream of talking animals might inspire a fable told to children. People embroidered their dreams like quilts, adding detail, shaping meaning, making it fit their worldview. Not everyone was treated equally in the world of dreams, though the dreams of holy people, monks, nuns, anchorites were given far more weight. If a nun dreamed of the Virgin Mary giving her bread, you could expect a statue to be built. If a farmhand dreamed of Mary well, that's nice. Thomas, now get back to mucking the stable. But even then, personal dreams mattered. They were a window into your soul, a glimpse of the eternal, and sometimes, just a deeply weird rehash of the cheese you ate at dusk. So tonight, when you dream whether of flying pigs, talking geese, or falling endlessly into your high school locker, know this. Your medieval self would have woken up, stared at the ceiling smoke, and whispered, "I think that means we need to check the grain silo," but then rolled over, prayed for protection, and tried to forget the feeling of wings sprouting from their back. Sleep wasn't just escape. It was a second life, one that mattered just as much. So, you've woken from your second sleep with a sore throat, a drippy nose, and the unmistakable suspicion that your lungs may have frozen somewhere between midnight and now. Congratulations, you're now officially medieval sick. And winter illnesses were no joke, huh? In fact, for many peasants, the most dangerous part of the cold season wasn't the frostbite, the dark, or even slipping on a frozen goat, though that did happen. It was illness, the kind that started with a sniffle and ended with a funeral procession. With no understanding of germs, bacteria, or how diseases actually spread, medieval folks relied on a cocktail of superstition, observation, and herbal experimentation to keep themselves alive. And you know what? Some of it kind of worked. Some of it was horrifying. And all of it was cold comfort when your lungs felt like porridge. Let's start with the basics. What kind of illnesses struck hardest in winter? Colds, flu, pneumonia, rashes, chilblains, frostbite, fevers of every flavor. Most households had at least one person coughing violently through the night, often while bundled in every blanket the family owned and muttering about visions of saints. If you made it through winter without one person losing a toe or coughing up something ominous, you were ahead of the curve. So what did peasants do? Well, first they turned to herbs. Every village had a wise woman, healer, or granny who knew what to do with nettles. Remedies were passed down like recipes. For coughs, a syrup made from boiled honey, vinegar, and thyme. For congestion, garlic, onions, and horseradish mashed into a paste and spread on your chest, or, if you were unlucky, into your nostrils. Sore throat, gargle salt water or beer, depending on how desperate you were. Sometimes the remedies were wrapped in ritual, saying prayers while mixing herbs, picking them at sunrise, or applying them only under a full moon. Not because people were weird, but because when you don't fully understand medicine, everything feels like magic, and timing is everything. Then there were steam treatments, surprisingly effective. People would sit by the fire with a pot of boiling water laced with herbs like sage or mint, a cloth over their heads, and sweat it out. Yes, your cousin might pass out, but they'd wake up breathing slightly better, or not at all. That was the gamble. Fevers were treated with cold compresses, sometimes snow wrapped in cloth, sometimes water infused with vinegar. If that didn't work, you were bled. Yes, bloodletting, everyone's least favorite medieval tradition. A cut, a leech, or a hot cup and blade, all designed to release the bad humors. Unfortunately, this also released good blood, energy, and your will to live. Foot baths were common for chills. You'd soak your feet in warm water with mustard seeds or ashes, wrap them in cloth, and pray your toes stayed on. Goose fat was rubbed into skin to prevent cracking. Brandy, if you could get it, was consumed like holy water, both as a treatment and, frankly, as a coping mechanism. And then there were the weird ones. Sleeping with a dead toad tied around your neck to draw out the illness. Wearing a sliced onion on a string to absorb disease. Drinking urine, either your own or someone else's, we won't name names. Burning a shoe to ward off ill air. Whispering the Lord's Prayer while hopping on one foot, which admittedly could warm you up, if nothing else. Peasants also believed in prevention, kind of. They didn't understand viruses, but they did notice that cold, damp air made people sick. So they tried to stay dry. They hung rushes on the floor to absorb moisture. They sealed windows with cloth. They slept close to fires, even if that meant waking up with a soot tan. But above all, they leaned on community care. Sick people weren't isolated, they were cared for by the family, fed hot pottage, covered with extra furs, given warm drinks or cool cloths. If they were very sick, someone would sit beside them through the night, praying, wiping sweat, and occasionally swapping out the toad necklace. When someone died, it was mourned, but also accepted. Life expectancy wasn't a promise. Winter was harsh. Illness could strike without warning. And yet, people kept going. Children still played in the snow, bundled like angry hedgehogs. Women still fetched water from half-frozen wells. Men still chopped wood until their fingers went numb. Life didn't stop for colds. It just adjusted. You worked slower. You shared warmth. You prayed harder. And sometimes you got better. Not because of leeches, not because of the toad, but because human bodies are stubborn, and so are the people living in them. So tonight, if you sneeze once and reach for tissues, cough twice and start Googling symptoms, remember your medieval ancestors? They survived winters with no medicine, no insulation, no soup that didn't taste like turnip, and they still made it to spring. Usually, unless they licked the goat again. That was never a good idea. It's 3 The fire's gone down to a whispering glow. Your straw mattress smells faintly of mildew and turnips. And the air has that special kind of bite that makes your nose feel like it's thinking about falling off. And yet, somehow, you're still asleep. Not just surviving, but enduring. So how did they do it? How did medieval peasants mentally survive the coldest nights of the year after year, with no central heating, no heated blankets, and no thermal socks? The answer isn't just physical, it's psychological. See, medieval peasants weren't constantly panicking about the cold because they expected it. Cold was a fact of life, like taxes, fleas, or your cousin's tendency to steal your bread. Winter didn't arrive with surprise and dread. It arrived like an old, rude friend, grumpy, uncomfortable, but familiar. Modern humans panic when the thermostat dips below 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Peasants, they were mentally prepared for months of discomfort. Not just because they were tougher, though they probably were, but because they didn't think of warmth as a right. They thought of it as a luxury or a bonus. Comfort wasn't an expectation, it was a blessing. Children were raised into this mindset from birth. Babies were swaddled tight, kept near the hearth, and taught from early on that you don't cry just because your fingers are stiff. You rub them, blow on them, stick them under someone else's armpit, and keep working. This wasn't stoicism, it was survival psychology. And it was reinforced by ritual and rhythm. Winter had a structure. Days were short, but they had routines: wake with the light, tend to the fire, care for animals, patch clothing, grind grain, prepare meals, mend tools, sleep. This rhythm gave meaning to even the coldest, darkest days. You weren't just surviving, you were doing things. Purpose distracts from misery. And faith played a massive role. Religion permeated daily life. Prayers were said in the morning, before bed, and at every mealtime, even if the meal was bread and sadness. People saw suffering as part of God's plan. Winter wasn't a punishment, it was a season of endurance. And enduring it with grace made you a better person. Or at least it was supposed to. People offered their discomfort as penance. They thanked God for their aches. They believed that enduring hardship on earth might earn them comfort in the afterlife. So, yes, the fire might be out, but hey, at least your soul was warming up for eternity. Let's not overlook the power of community resilience. You weren't going through winter alone. You had your family, your village, the neighbor who always showed up with a bit of extra straw, the old woman who told stories to distract children from their chattering teeth. Misery, when shared, becomes manageable. Laughter helped too. Yes, peasants laughed, told jokes, sang songs, mocked each other for the icicles on their eyebrows. Humor was a shield. Making fun of how awful things were made them less awful. Remember last year when Grandpa slept with a goose and woke up missing a tooth? Classic. That kind of thing. And stories? Nights were long, and words were free. People told folk tales, legends, ghost stories, and sometimes complete nonsense just to pass the time. You might not feel your toes, but at least you were listening to your aunt describe the time she saw a fairy riding a squirrel through the thatch. And there was always spring. It's easy to survive the coldest night when you know it won't last forever. Even the hardest winters ended. Snow melted. Days lengthened. The first green shoots cracked through frozen dirt. Hope wasn't abstract, it was cyclical. Peasants understood the seasons like a rhythm in their blood. Suffering was seasonal. It had an end date. Contrast that with modern despair. We get cold and think it's the end of the world. They got cold and thought, mid-January. They also celebrated the small wins. A warm fire, a pot of stew, a day without frostbite. A story that made everyone laugh until they forgot their numb fingers. These weren't just moments. They were triumphs. You didn't need a heated blanket. You needed a reason to smile through the chill. And there's something deeply powerful in that. This mindset, this mix of endurance, faith, humor, ritual, and community built resilient people. Not because they wanted to be, but because they had to be. And over time, that necessity became identity. They weren't fragile because the world didn't allow it. They were strong because the cold didn't care. And that strength wasn't loud. It didn't make speeches. It just got up, threw another log on the fire or another sibling in the bed, and kept going. So tonight, if your room feels a little chilly, if your blanket isn't quite tucked right, or if your hot water bottle isn't perfectly hot, think about what kept your ancestors warm. A bit of wool, a shared laugh, a stubborn streak a mile long, and the unshakable belief that tomorrow would be just a little brighter. It's February now, still cold, still dark, But something has changed in the air. The days are ever so slightly longer. You notice the frost takes a little longer to form on your breath. Someone in the village swears they saw a crocus. You think they hallucinated. But even if it's freezing, hope has begun to stir. And with that hope comes one thing that medieval peasants knew how to celebrate: rituals and seasonal festivities. See, just because it was bone-chillingly cold didn't mean people sat around all winter waiting to thaw. In fact, the worst months of the year were punctuated with holidays, saints' days, and weird customs that gave peasants something to do and something to look forward to, even when their toes were numb. Let's start with Candlemas, on February 2nd. Not quite Christmas, not quite spring, but a day when peasants gathered in the local church, candles in hand, praying for the return of the sun. It was both religious and symbolic light in the darkness, literal and metaphorical. Afterward, people brought the blessed candles home and used them as a kind of spiritual heating system. Not warm in temperature, but comforting to the soul. Before that, there was Twelfth Night and Epiphany in early January. When the last of the Yuletide celebrations wound down, the poor might get scraps from the Lord's feast. Children would sing songs, and adults would drink like spring was already here. Bread with hidden beans, mischief, masked dances, just enough revelry to keep morale above freezing. And yes, there were carnivals, especially leading up to Lent. Picture this: a town square packed with mud, animals, shouting vendors, people wearing paper crowns, and someone dressed as a bear for no discernible reason. You, still shivering from the night before, clutch a warm onion pie in your mittened hands. It's chaos. It's cold. It's festivity in spite of the frost. Winter was also the time of storytelling customs. Long nights meant long tales. Villagers would gather, not just for warmth, but for entertainment. The best storyteller could get a warm seat near the fire, extra ale, or the last bit of pottage. You had ghost stories, morality plays, fables involving talking donkeys who knew too much about grain storage. These tales weren't just to pass time. They were a shared cultural memory, repeated and reshaped each season. And if the weather got truly brutal, there were rituals to ward off the cold. People lit bonfires on certain nights, hoping to drive away evil spirits and, possibly, trick the sun into coming back. Others banged pots and pans to scare away winter, or hung rowan branches to protect the home from frost demons and nosy neighbors. In some areas, people buried eggs as a promise to spring. No, it didn't help, but it felt like it might. And let's not forget saints' days, which were everywhere on the calendar. Every third day seemed to be some holy figure's birthday, martyrdom, or vague heavenly anniversary. And each one was an excuse for a little ceremony, a procession, a song, a shared meal, or a candle-lit prayer circle. It gave people structure, meaning, reasons to keep going when the firewood pile was low and the goat looked like it was planning an escape. Even in the darkest times, peasants invented ways to celebrate survival. Was it freezing? Yes. Was there disease constantly? Were they ever not slightly damp? No. But they danced. They sang. They told stories about saints who'd slept in snowdrifts and survived on pine needles. And in doing so, they told themselves they'd be okay, too. There were also rites of passage during the winter. Babies born in cold months were often baptized with icy water, wrapped in whatever furs could be spared, and fed strange herbal broths. It was a rough start in life, but these children were believed to be stronger for it. Winterborn had a kind of mythic toughness, less coddled, more determined. Even marriages happened in winter, believe it or not. Not as many as in the fertile spring, of course. But when resources were pooled and harvest was long done, two families might decide, Well, we're not doing anything else. Let's have a wedding. The feast would be modest. The clothes would be hand-me-downs. But the joy still real, still needed. And funerals, yes, there were funerals. Winter took many. Graves had to be dug in frozen ground. The dead were wrapped in whatever was available: old cloaks, burlap, sometimes just straw. But people came. People sang. Because even in mourning, they remembered ritual is how we survive. Through all of this, peasants never lost their humor. Cold fingers means you're still alive. Frost in your beard, you're just aging faster. Someone falls in the snow. God pushed you for being lazy. Rituals weren't just about faith. They were about finding joy, warmth, and meaning in the middle of discomfort. So tonight, if you're warm, full, and dreading tomorrow's mildly chilly walk to the store, remember your medieval counterpart. Wrapped in wool, singing by candlelight, laughing with cracked lips, dancing in the mud. Because even when their world was frozen, they still found reasons to celebrate. You're still here, tucked under your modern duvet, scrolling slowly through this late-night story, maybe sipping tea, maybe adjusting your thermostat just a little. Meanwhile, outside your window, the night might be cold, but not medieval cold. And hopefully, there are no goats in your hallway. We've spent the night walking through freezing thatched cottages, beside sputtering fires, under wool blankets shared by too many bodies. We've coughed beside peasant hearths, watched herbs boil in smoky kitchens, and heard ghost stories in the dark. And somehow, you've made it to morning. But before we part ways, let's answer the question that started it all. Why did medieval peasants survive the coldest nights? Because they had to, yes. Because they were resilient, sure. But more than that, they understood something we often forget: that warmth isn't just heat. It's human. It's shared. It's carried in laughter, in rituals, in a stubborn belief that tomorrow will be better even if your fingers are frozen today. Let's recap what you've discovered. They built houses that were drafty and damp and made them homes by filling them with stories, family, and hope. They layered wool and dirt and rags and turned that into armor against the frost. They didn't have hot showers. They didn't have radiators, but they had each other. They slept in piles. They shared food when there was barely any. They prayed. They joked. They danced in frozen fields just because it felt good to move. They buried the dead in the snow and still sang. And they told stories. Oh, the stories. Of saints who warmed the sick with their breath. Of witches who could start fires with a glance. Of long winters survived not by the strong, but by the clever, the patient, and the kind. Those stories were their fires. Tonight, maybe you're warm and comfortable and ready to sleep. Or maybe you're cold not just in temperature, but in spirit. Maybe this winter has felt like a medieval one. Long, dark, hard. You're not alone in that. But if a 14th century shepherd with chilblains on his nose and only turnips in his pantry could make it through January, maybe you can too. Because some of those lessons still matter, still burn, faintly, in the hearth of history. Like, you don't need comfort to have joy. You don't need warmth to share kindness. And you don't need luxury to feel safe, just one other human who doesn't steal your half of the blanket. So next time your heating goes out, or your toes get cold, or the night just feels a bit too long, imagine yourself back in that peasant cottage. Picture the firelight flickering. Someone snores. Someone laughs. Someone starts telling a story about a pig that cursed a noble. And you, wrapped in scratchy wool and surrounded by sleep, start smiling in the dark, Because even then, even there, they found reasons to survive. And if they did, so can you. Sleep well. So, you made it. Through 15 parts, through frostbitten fingers, candlelit stories, shared beds with 5 siblings and a goat, through wind that whispered through cracks in the thatch, through dreams, illness, fear, and second sleep. And now you're here, in the quiet, at the end of it all. Maybe your blanket is warm. Maybe the only draft in your room is from a window you could easily shut. Maybe you're sipping something hot. Or maybe your fingers are curled under your pillow, tucked in just right. But no matter where or how you're listening, I want to leave you with something more than facts. I want to leave you with a memory that isn't yours but could have been. Because that's what history really is. Not names, not dates, not who built what, but people, real people, who felt cold, just like you, who were scared, like you, who laughed in the dark, like you, and who, even in their hardest, coldest moments, kept going. Let's talk about what we really learned. First, they didn't survive alone. This was the golden thread that tied every part of their frozen world together: community. You didn't just make it through the winter because you were strong. You made it because someone shared their bread with you, because someone let you tuck your toes under their calves, because someone told you a joke that made you laugh so hard. The cold didn't seem so cruel anymore. In a time without electric heat, it turns out the warmest thing you had was another person. That still holds true. Second, they had rituals. Not just religious ones, though those mattered, but rhythms, patterns. Days built around meaningful moments, no matter how small. Stirring a pot of pottage, blessing a candle, hanging rushes on the floor, telling the same ghost story every year. These rituals weren't about superstition alone. They were about control, a way to shape chaos into something survivable. They told themselves the same stories until those stories became truths. That the cold would end, that they would endure, that next spring would come, and eventually it did. We all need our rituals now, too. Even if it's just tea at the same hour, or pressing play on a sleepy history podcast before bed. These aren't just habits. They're lifelines. Third, they embraced humor: grim, strange, often smelly humor, but humor all the same. It's easy to think of the medieval world as colorless, joyless, hopeless. But that's a modern illusion. Those peasants knew suffering better than we ever will. But they also knew laughter could be survival. They made fun of each other, of their own shivering, of rats, of death itself. They knew you could either cry or cackle when your chamber pot froze solid, and sometimes both were valid. The cold was cruel, so they were funny. There's a lesson in that. Fourth, they understood time differently. We rush, we panic. We're told we should be better by this week, this quarter, this year. But medieval peasants lived by the seasons. Winter wasn't a failure. It was a phase, a hibernation, a sacred pause. You didn't grow crops in January. You survived January. And that was enough. Maybe, just maybe, we should allow ourselves the same grace. Maybe it's okay if you're not blooming right now. Maybe it's enough that you're still here, wrapped up, making it through the dark. Because here's the truth. Survival is not passive. It's not just waiting for better days. It's choosing to keep going when your fingers are stiff, when your spirit is tired, when your blankets aren't enough. It's sharing warmth when you don't have much. It's waking up after your second sleep and deciding, yes, I'll do this again. And fifth, the biggest lesson. They knew spring was coming. No matter how long, how brutal, how hungry or hopeless the winter felt, spring always followed. The frost didn't last forever. The snow melted. The first crocus poked through the dirt. The bees returned, and the cold became a memory. Even the coldest night eventually ends. And even if you're in your own kind of winter right now, a quiet sadness, a personal frost, a season of numbness, you are walking a path your ancestors knew well. And like them, you will come out the other side. That is your inheritance, not castles or coats or cups of ale, but endurance. So the next time your heating breaks, or your hands are cold, or life feels a bit too drafty and dim, remember this story. Remember these people, the ones who sang in frost, who laughed with cracked lips, who survived the coldest nights with nothing but straw, soup, and stubbornness. And remember that if they could do it, so can you, because you, too, are made of tougher stuff than you realize. So now, as the fire dies low and the final candles flicker out, let yourself rest. Let your thoughts settle like fresh snow on a quiet field. And know that somewhere in the echoes of history, a medieval peasant is smiling. Not because life was easy, but because, against all odds, they made it through the night. And now you will too. Good night.